it can be very overwhelming when we think about things like digital inclusion and access, as an example, obviously, that spiked over the last couple of years. But in terms of thinking about how you approach solving it, if you don't think about where's the highest and best use of what I do well, and how do I find all of the other parties, all of the other types of organizations that can do their highest and best use, that's the only way we solve it. You can't become an expert in everything. You can't have all the knowledge. Nobody has all the resources. So it's really about the puzzle piecing and kind of the solar system that we're all trying to connect.
Hi, Smart Community friends. In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I have a wonderful chat with Jennifer Sanders, who you may remember from episode 170 that was released in May of 2020. Jennifer is the co-founder and executive director at the Dallas Innovation Alliance, the DIA, a public-private partnership dedicated to supporting the design and execution of a smart cities plan for Dallas. In this episode, Jennifer starts by telling us about her background in communications and change management, and also about her passion for Dallas and her focus on making change locally. She then tells us what a smart community means to her. Jennifer then shares with us what she's been working on since we last spoke in 2020 and what changes she has seen in the smart community space since then. We then discuss how she collaborates across state and country and some of her learnings from these partnerships. Jennifer also shares with us some of the interesting projects she's been working on, and we discuss the digital divide and how we can overcome this in our communities. We finish our chat discussing the emerging trends of data privacy and protection policy approaches and the importance of designing and embedding best practices into processes from the very beginning. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Jen. How are you today?
I'm so well. How are you doing?
I am also very well, and I am very excited to have you back on the podcast. We're just having a look, and it was May 2020 was the last episode released, and I was looking at the show notes, and actually we recorded that episode pre-COVID. So what a wild time.
I can't even wrap my head around it, honestly. Wow. We're even more to catch up on than we realized.
Yes. So let's just jump straight in. And can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
Oh, for sure. So I'm one of those transplant Texans. So I grew up in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, and would have never told you that I would end up in Texas, and have been here since 2005. So my background is in communications and change management, liberal arts all the way, and then somehow, stumbled into this concept of the intersection of economic development and people and technology and energy, and just really became fascinated by where my clients were going, and then just really wanted to do something about it. And so very passionate about Dallas, have come to love it and consider it home, and now really focused on making change locally and then figuring out how we can expand and help each other around the world.
Yeah, excellent. And you've been doing lots of stuff since the last time we spoke, and we must have recorded early in 2020 or even late in 2019, now that I'm thinking about it, because I remember batching a lot of episodes before I went over to America, actually. But anyway, regardless of that, we'll get to that. But let's first start with, what is a smart community to you?
So a smart community to me is really, I always think about it as the integration of a number of things. So when we look at how we improve quality of life and quality of place, you want to look at the people first, but you want to say, where are their tools, whether it's design-oriented technology or data, that help become catalysts for us to get to where we want all of us to go and the types of lives we want to live in.
Yeah, I like that. And knowing the work that you do, none of that stuff happens in a silo, right? It's all about collaboration and bringing people together. And I think that is a really key component, which sometimes maybe we often forget about until we try and do a project and realize how many different parties have to be involved if we want to, build these communities of the future.
Amen. No, we can't do it alone. These problems are too big. So number one, it can be very overwhelming when we think about things like digital inclusion and access, as an example, obviously, that spiked over the last couple of years. But in terms of thinking about how you approach solving it, if you don't think about where's the highest and best use of what I do well, and how do I find all of the other parties, all of the other types of organizations that can do their highest and best use, that's the only way we solve it. You can't become an expert in everything. You can't have all the knowledge. Nobody has all the resources. So it's really about the puzzle piecing and kind of the solar system that we're all trying to connect. And that's one of the things I'm most passionate about, is how do we figure out who needs to be in the room that maybe it never occurred to them that they would ever need to be in the same room with some of these other functions or departments or organizations. And then you really see where the magic happens from there.
Mm-hmm. So last time we recorded, as we said, it was early 2020. Tell me what you were doing then, and what's probably too much in one question, but then what's changed since 2020? Like, we talked a lot about regional, like smart regions and connecting across the regions, and you were building up the North Texas Innovation Alliance. So give us a little bit of a snapshot of what was happening back then and what's happening now.
Oh, wild. So to your point, early 2020, we were in the midst of really building the regional alliance, which really I always joked was the Dallas Innovation Alliance on steroids, and looking at how do you go from serving a single community to 7 times, the size from a population standpoint, and probably even more than that from a landmass standpoint. And how can we do better together and do more with less to serve the whole region? But the projects I was really working on deeply in early 2020 were around challenges in communities that had been underserved, underrepresented. And so we were looking at issues of equity, specifically mobility, public safety, and the digital divide. And obviously, as we got into March of 2020, the world really understood how critical internet access was and broadband access, and had always known that that was a really important thing, but it was just made so acutely, starkly in the spotlight, obviously, when the world shut down, that we really accelerated a lot of the work that we've been doing in digital inclusion and continue to do so with dozens, if not, over 100 different partners, not just across locally, but really across the world, in terms of how can we learn from each other and really tackle this massive challenge. So that's kind of the immediate work. And then we can dig in more, but since we have been part of launching 2 other nonprofits, one formally launching the North Texas Innovation Alliance, but then with 6 of our peers around the country in similar consortiums, launched the National Smart Coalitions Partnership, which is meant to, again, how do we connect the dots and the learnings across the country with organizations that have been structured like ours. So that's been just incredibly exciting to see what the art of the possible is when we all work together cross state, cross country.
And I know we haven't quite finished that answer yet, and we were talking just before, pre-podcast, pre-chat, thinking about the collaboration component of this. When you've set up an organization like this, what does it actually look like, I guess, day to day or month to month? Like how, because I know, like, particularly in Australia, and we were just speaking about overseas, it's so imperative that we do this, but sometimes it can be quite overwhelming to kind of think about what this would actually look like on a larger scale. So on that larger scale, what does it look like? Is it, are we having monthly meetings, or are we doing projects together? What does it actually look like day to day?
It changes every day, which is one of the really incredible things, because I feel like I always joke, I feel like I'm getting my PhD on the ground every day, because it's just constantly changing. You're constantly learning. But I think with consortiums like this, part of the balance, particularly I've learned with the regional, and then national is a whole nother ball of wax, but is really how do you balance supporting the individual municipalities and other organizations with looking at the collective? Because everyone is starting from such a different place in terms of understanding how do we approach things in an innovative way? in a cross-disciplinary way, in a smart way, as we each define it, I suppose. So how do you work together to pull those that are earlier in the conversation? How do you accelerate them more quickly through learning from a peer-to-peer kind of informal mentorship way? So how are we helping everyone to move as quickly as possible, while also keeping in mind the larger vision with the longer term programs, which do become a combination of policy change and physically putting projects in the ground, in the air, across the cloud, But it's really always a balance between short and long term and kind of micro level change and acceleration, with making sure that we're testing the broad solutions and working through everything that takes.
And I've been thinking, when I talk to local governments here and state governments here, it's like connecting across, sitting in the same seat, but in the next council over, or the next local government over, or state government equivalent. And I'm keen to hear some of your thoughts around, or what have people told you, kind of unexpected, I guess, learnings from those collaborations? Because I know, talking to different people, it's not necessarily, I learned about this project. It's some of those other kind of nuances that, I didn't realize that we did it like this. And actually, that's a good idea that we're going to try in our council or our local government, etc. What are some of the things that people are telling you when they're involved in consortiums like this that they're learning?
I think one of the most exciting collaborations or learnings from last year was around, and again, approach to broadband. And so I think sometimes, smaller cities may feel like we're small, it's different. It's not that big a deal what we're doing. But there were these 4 very small cities that came together and formally created an interlocal agreement. And these 4 cities together designed a broadband plan, put out a request for proposals, and have just contracted the vendors that are going to put fiber throughout these 4 cities. And the structure of that is something everyone is trying to figure out how to do, because it's multi-public agency, and then it's it's a private partnership thrown in there. In a lot of cases, there's academic institutions involved. And so what's been so wonderful to follow along that journey with them and to support them is the way that it's impacted the learnings for much larger cities in our region, who are now calling upon this town of 10,000 to support cities of 500,000 to 1.5 million in terms of learning. How did you get through this process? How did you create, a lot of it's about how do you get over the legal hurdles of creating these formal partnerships that are necessary to be able to get these larger projects done and be able to do it more cost effectively and more time effectively, and ultimately provide better services. So I think those learnings between cities that may have not looked to each other in the past are actively learning from each other and collaborating. And that's one of the most gratifying things to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, looking to a town or a city of 10,000 people and going, what can we learn from you, is really powerful, because it shows, one, that no community is too small to be a smart community, but also that we all have things to learn from each other because we've had different experiences. And I think, and obviously that's, at a government level, but also like a personal level, you can kind of bring it back down to that as well, where I can learn from absolutely anybody because we have so many different experiences. And I think that's the same across our communities as well. And I think, that's really, I guess, important in this space, because no one has done everything, or no city or town has done everything. I think sometimes we look, let's look to, Singapore or Dubai or whatever the case is, because they're in inverted commas smart city. But actually there's real amazing pockets of innovation and pockets of smart things happening in really small towns, and actually we can learn from those as well. And it's the non-sexy stuff as well that we need to get over, right? It's the legal stuff, it's the regulation, building those partnerships. And I think once we're able to do that, then we can really progress forward, which I find is so exciting. And I know the work that you do is right in that space as well, is bringing people together to learn from each other.
100%. And I think too, there's so frequently, governments and the private sector too will say, we just can't figure out how to get over this hump, which often is legal, and to say, this isn't going to work, this isn't going to work. And then to say, look at precedent that you wouldn't necessarily think applies here. And so one example would be across the country, and certainly, in Dallas-Fort Worth, there's a lot of examples of really large scale public-private partnerships to build things like parks or stadiums or airports, and to say, why don't we look at how we got over the hurdles with those types of projects from a funding and an operations and a cross-county collaboration, and you can apply that to broadband. Why couldn't you? You can apply that to large-scale sustainability initiatives, but sometimes it feels, I think to some, it's like, yeah, but that was a park. And I'm like, but it was the same hurdles. It was the same needs. You were sharing money. You were sharing jurisdictions. You were sharing resources. So really, are there examples and precedents closer than we think that maybe just we thought we had to be more apples to apples than you do in reality?
Yeah, I think that's really an important insight as well. We don't just have to look at digital v digital, right, and learn in inverted commas from those projects. We can look at the other things that we do on the, might be the same scale or just might have the same kind of approach. And then we tailor it to what we need for whatever projects we're looking at. Because, we know that we can, form partnerships. We know that we can work together when it's necessary to do so, or when something seems like we must, or, we have to be able to get this thing to move forward because we think it's really important. And choose those learnings that we need to build something else that might be a little bit different. And I think COVID has shown us that as well, that when we've had to, we've had to shift and change really, really quickly. And I imagine you've seen that across all the different partnerships that you've been dealing with, how people have adapted really to be online and to do all those things. Are there any kind of interesting projects that you've seen kind of pop up? Well, there's probably 1,000, since you've started the organization, the North Texas Innovation Alliance, January 2020, I guess it would have been very different. Well, we don't know, do we? But a different experience from what you thought you might have been going into, and then COVID hitting right after that. What are some of the interesting projects and things that you saw kind of come up during this time?
Right, so many. But the first, and I guess this is more of an example of really knowing that timing is everything and how important this collaboration is in the recognition of it, because we had our third meeting was scheduled for what ended up being the day that shelter in place went into effect in Dallas County. So I thought, oh gosh, we're not going to, I may have 4 people able to show up because everyone's managing, the quarantine, within their cities, but we're going to have it anyway. Right. And just see how we can be of support. And we had over 30 different entities join that call, even in the midst of trying to do that. And the immediate sharing, how are you dealing with X? We have court dates, or, how quickly can we bring people back into City Hall, into shelters, and how is transit operating? How are you guys working towards sanitizing? And, so all of, the fact that everybody still made the time, these officials in the midst of uncharted territory all came together and just we were able to have an open conversation where they were seeking counsel from each other was just so powerful. And I went, okay, everybody really gets it. And, when people are willing to invest their most precious time, you're on the right track. And so that was kind of literally was the day that everyone had to start quarantining. It was just wild. But, since then we've had other challenges, not, the winter storm, that was globally infamous with the grid coming very close to going out in Texas. Similarly, there was a convening, probably a week after, when we were still dealing with the impacts, and what the group, chose to focus on is what do we still need, but what have we learned that we can control locally moving forward in similar circumstances? And so talking about things like real-time understanding of who had fuel for the generators, for the buses, and what types of facilities, because we were still needing to roll calls to different facilities to understand who had diesel, for everyone to keep folks off the roads as much as possible, kind of hunting down fuel for generators. And so can we look at a unified asset inventory, across different types of entities like school districts, transit agencies, and cities? And so really looking at, again, how do you hyper focus on what is within our control, right? And how can we better serve in crisis situations that we all know are going to become more, are continuing to become more frequent. So whether it's a tornado or a hailstorm or a pandemic or a wild deep freeze, the processes are the same, and the ways that we are able to come together is a skill to continue to hone. So those are process oriented, some examples of what we've seen, but certainly, things like how do we get every student connected and being able to get 150,000 hotspots into homes within a 90-day period is that only happens when you have multiple jurisdictions, multiple types of entities, foundations, school, everybody coming together and meeting on a weekly basis to get these contracts done and get these distributions done. And so it was really beautiful, in the face of all of this.
And I think it also takes a whole range of different voices at the table to be thinking about all of these things. It's interesting to see, when we said, okay, everyone has to go to school at home. If you only have people sitting at the table who had no problems accessing devices or had no problems connecting to the internet or had enough rooms available for the students or whatever, if you only have people like that, and often we do that, we're thinking, leaders are thinking about these things, bringing people in that may be thinking about these other things like, oh, well, I know that my neighbours don't have access to enough devices. Okay, well, actually, we need to do something about that's an urgent issue that we need to do something about if everybody has to go home, because they should be able to have the same ability to learn as others. And knowing that, if for a short time maybe it was okay to make do, but actually moving forward, we're still in it, aren't we? We're still in it now. But I think that for me was a really key one where I when I stopped to think about things like, oh, well, what if I couldn't access my computer? What if I couldn't do this? Then a lot of things, it just becomes a whole bunch harder, which, talking about digital divide, increases it even more and more. And I think that's something that we started to talk about during the pandemic. We're still during, but I think coming out of this, we can't forget that again and see what we can do to move forward. Some things might be inconvenient for somebody who has access, but actually for someone who doesn't or is relying on certain things, it's not just inconvenient, it can really affect people's lives. And I think that's something that the smart community space is, that's what we're thinking about, right? And the point of these partnerships is to bring people together, to be able to have these conversations, to bring those different experiences, and not just themselves, obviously, but who are they talking to, what are their community members telling them that are problems, and really listening and understanding those is something that's really key.
Oh, it's so critical. And to your point, I think people talk in terms of equity specifically, people talk a lot about the need for proximity, right? If you're not getting into those communities, to your point, and you can't possibly have a true understanding of what the problem is, but certainly not what an effective solution is, and at the beginning of the pandemic, I think there was this move across anyone that was doing communication, and they said, well, we're pushing it out on social. But if you're at home and you don't have internet, or you don't have a phone plan, or that's not sufficient. So how do you solve for, we can't be in community physically, but how do you present the information consistently and accurately and effectively into these communities and understand what they need? And so some of the learnings we had, because I think last time we talked about, I was getting the mobile learning lab ready to launch the Wi-Fi bus in that classroom. And so, thank goodness, it was ready, not right when everything shut down, but within late spring, we were able to get it on the road. And so we were able to go into communities and provide a blast of Wi-Fi with a decent radius, which isn't a permanent solution, but certainly was meant to support there and support the kids with their remote learning and different pieces like that. But certainly seeing things like if families didn't realize they could request more than one hotspot or more than one device to come home, because some of these families have, 5 kids in the home, and one hotspot is not going to power 5 Zoom sessions, right? And sometimes you don't have 5 devices with which kids, so they had told me, well, X child gets to go to class Mondays and Wednesdays, but they would have to literally stagger the days the kids could do remote learning. And so, but if they didn't realize the resources were there, they couldn't access them. And that's something that we learned too through the city of Dallas and Dallas Independent School District came together and did a joint digital equity strategic plan. And some of the research that was done around in these communities, in these lowest connected zip codes, how many of them were taking advantage of federal broadband programs, the emergency broadband benefit being one. And I think less than half had even heard of the program. less than 5% had enrolled that were eligible and needed it. And so that really speaks to the gap, the need for heavier investment in these on the ground kind of ambassador programs in these communities, because if awareness and adoption is the true gap, solving for that is a lot more labor intensive, right, than a lot of other methods that have been utilized in the past. So it just, again, it really spoke to, you have to have hyper local resources that have all the information and can disseminate it door to door in some cases. But how do we create mechanisms and programs that can do that effectively, especially with information that changes so quickly as these programs change? And so that's actually a program that we're working on developing right now, which is exciting.
Yeah, wow. No, it's, those numbers, they're really
they're heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Oh, Lord help me. Yeah. But when you think about, my first thought was, it's free money on the table, because it's like the opposite of Field of Dreams. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Field of Dreams, but the line is, if you build it, they will come. And I'm like, if you build it, they won't necessarily come, if you're not doing the other half of the work to get them connected, right? And so all of these really heavy infrastructure investments, which are spectacular and are generationally changing, life-changing, are huge, and they're huge dollars. But if you don't look at that flip side of adoption or use, it's missed the point, Yeah,
and I was kind of going to say the same thing. It's the investment in the engagement and the communication is found the key. You can't, we talk about this from, just even a small technology perspective, but when you think about this, really big investment on and again, talking about American program, I'm not exactly sure all the details, but I assume it's, connecting to broadband internet in some kind of subsidy or whatever the case may be. And getting that adoption is, that should be the metric for success, right? So people can actually uptake it. But if we don't tell people about it, if they don't know how to connect, they don't know who can connect, they don't know what they're able to get, then it's not a project that is going to be successful. You might have all the infrastructure there and you tick all those boxes, but if people aren't connecting, and sometimes maybe they do know it's available, but they don't know how, or, there's so many different nuances, but if they don't have the information, or if somebody isn't helping them to do it as well, because we know that there's, quite low levels of trust and all these type of things that all feed into, and even just, the way, culture says, oh, well, I'll figure it out on my own, but actually it's available, it's there. And I guess when people are able to connect to, if they adopt, but you can ask other questions, like if people aren't adopting it, oh, why, is it not fast enough, or is it, whatever the case is. And I think then we can learn more and more and improve even further. And that's so important. And I think when we talk about smart communities, if we don't have that base level kind of connectivity and understanding and dissemination of information, then we can't build on top of that. And I think that's, it's key, and it's really, really foundational. I think we don't talk about that enough, and if we don't, also, you lose a lot of the community. If we're only talking about this super advanced, cool stuff or whatever, they go, hang on, I can't even connect to the internet. What am I going to do with an autonomous vehicle? Or, the person next to me has got an autonomous vehicle. What am I, this isn't even a conversation I can be involved in, because I can't even connect to the internet to do my remote learning or whatever the case is. And I think we don't want to leave people behind, which is really key to why we talk about smart communities rather than smart cities, because we want to connect with the community on that level.
I totally agree. If you could jump straight to a shiny object, I know we've talked before, and I know you talk a lot about not being distracted or not jumping straight to the autonomous vehicle or the flying car if you're not looking, boots on the ground and things like that. And I think one of the things that we're really focused on right now is trying to support governments in being exceptionally strategic and collaborative in how they spend, not to keep going back to the federal dollars. We just may never have this kind of funding opportunity again. But when you talk about building the infrastructure digitally that powers internet in the home, but also can create more efficiency in traffic signals, through automating those, which also powers autonomous vehicles, you need all of that infrastructure, but are we designing it in a way that it can do all of those things with one investment? So are we, to the cross-departmental and the collaborative standpoint, are we looking at what are the needs and where, and make sure that we're designing a network that can do more and not looking at fragmented approaches to building, because that network should be able to do 3, 5, 7 things, at once with one investment.
Yeah, that's also so important. And like we do talk a lot on the podcast around going back to the basics, but also, I guess, on the flip side of that, we do want to be looking to the future. We know it's not going to be the same. Tomorrow's not going to be the same as today. And if we look 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years into the future, which we want to be, we do need to start thinking about those things. And like you said, the foundations that can support me connecting to the internet or someone else connecting to the internet then can also support those higher level order things that we're thinking about and talking about. And like so many different people, we have lots of people in the world and lots of people can think about lots of different things, and it's about bringing it together. And I think, that's so important to continue to look to that horizon as well, because if we only think about the problems we have today, we're only solving the problems of the past and not thinking about the ones that we're going to have in the future and actually mitigating those. And obviously, we can't mitigate everything. Disruption is just that. Disrupting change is continuing to happen. But we start thinking about these things or continue to think about these things at that level and building on those, we can have a more kind of integrated approach rather than, like you said, that fragmented approach, which we don't want to see moving forward into the future, because we know what that causes. We know the issues and pain points, particularly within governments. They know more than anyone, the legacy systems and things. And so I think that's also really important, that we don't want to say, oh, no, that's not happening, or that's not important, that's not coming, because we know these things are coming. And also what we want to do with those things. We don't necessarily want the autonomous vehicle to shape our lives how the combustion engine vehicle did, the motor, the driving vehicle, the one that we drove. We don't necessarily want to watch our cities transform to suit the autonomous vehicle. We actually want the cities for people, and we want to shape how does that autonomous vehicle potentially come into the cities that we have shaped for people, not the other way around. So I think that will be really key as well, because we want all those people at the table so then we can actually have those conversations, and we're not talking just in abstract ways, but actually real things, real projects, real people on the ground.
It's so critical. And I think when we talked a little bit at the beginning about the not sexy things, right, that have to be part of all of this, when I think about autonomous vehicles and how that changes the whole fabric and policy, you think about things like parking, right? And then you start talking about parking minimums and how are we designing parking garages if, folks are insisting we still need that, but how do we make sure that those are easily convertible, to other things, as we ideally and certainly believe that the number of cars on the road is going to go down. And, Dallas is currently taking a fresh look at their parking minimums, which, for different types of buildings, it requires a certain number of parking spaces per square feet. And it's wild how high that is. And I think cities all over the world probably look at that on some level. But regardless, if you're looking at changing parking minimums, that's critical as you're thinking about other types of land use. But it's amazing how politically fiery, it can be to talk about taking away parking on any level, right? So that's one of the necessary and quirky conversations that has to happen alongside all of this, especially as we talk about walkability of neighborhoods and safety and all of that. So it's all integrated. And some of it, again, is getting, you have to get back down to basics, right? And be able to have done that correctly in order for anything else to be enabled.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And when I did my Churchill Fellowship traveling around, I went to Mexico, and one of the SMART projects that I talked about was their parking reform. And it wasn't just, okay, now we're going to take away car parks, so, setting different policy levers. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was, whether it's maximums and that type of thing. But actually, well, if we're going to do that, what public transport do we need to put in place to serve, and how is it going to be walkable? So adding those different options all comes into that parking conversation. It's not parking, it's mobility, and how do people get there and go to and fro and that type of thing as well. And I thought that was really interesting. And that's the conversations, that we need to have. It's not just, okay, we're reducing parking or whatever it is. It's
we're offering, what other options or better options, sustainable options are we offering people in the mobility space. So I think that's really important, that we're broadening out the conversations now to not be about, a mode, but actually about full mobility.
Oh, 100%. Oh, I love that. I need to look more deeply into that process they went through when they did that. So I'm putting it on my list.
Yes. Yeah. I'll send you the deets that I found. But it was something that I found when I was doing my research. And again, so much in that. I'm just looking at the time. We've been talking for a long time. Well, not that long. I feel like we could talk for much, much, much longer.
I know.
I was just like, oh my goodness. Okay, so let's zoom to the future now. And can you tell us about the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
I think one of the biggest focuses that people are talking about, but I don't think we figured out yet, is the privacy aspect of all of this, right? And so I think something that I'm really trying to dig into is, what are best practices in approaching data privacy and protection policies? And when we look at that a lot from resident trust and community trust is a big piece of it as cities are leveraging data more, but also looking at what responsibility is there for the public sector to teach its residents on how to protect themselves online, as an example. But I think the privacy conversation and coming to terms with what and how do we set those policies and those commitments, to residents is something that I think is going to continue to not just be top of mind, but really need to be dug into. And we see that with the number of, in the public sector, certainly the number of chief privacy officers and dedicated privacy roles separate from an information security officer role. And what does that mean? And how do they work together? And where's the interrelation between all of this? So I think the privacy conversation is kind of still under the radar in terms of execution, but certainly not in terms of the importance of it. And I think Emily Yates in Philadelphia and the advisory task forces that they're setting up, an evaluation of unintended consequences and different pieces as they put together programs that relate to data is something that, we're looking at and learning from really closely, and then many, many others. But so the privacy piece, I think, and then I think, again, it's these projects that can solve for 5 different, challenges in the same swoop or in the same investment. And so some of them is re-looking at the role of anchor institutions or anchor developments like universities or other complexes in serving the broader community. And one project that very early days that I'm looking at is how can we support public agencies in reaching electrification targets while also protecting the community through things like resiliency hubs and microgrids and training opportunities for next generation careers. But if we can put all of these elements together into a single investment in a single location, how do we do that well? How do we think ahead for unintended consequences like gentrification, which is an affordability challenge for these surrounding communities? But again, it just involves bringing more and more people to the table and finding those commonalities. So I think creative design of solutions, the data privacy piece, and really looking toward that are a goal that certainly we're really, really deep into right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important, and having a lot of different people on the podcast talking about that and hoping to get more, because it's about designing it in from the very beginning and continuing the conversations, right, as you said, and giving people permission to ask the questions, I think is also really important, and not just accept this is what it is and this is what we've accepted, but continuing to ask questions and how they do that in a way that works for them, and having those answers as well, I think is key. And we'll continue to learn, right? And we'll have to continue to build the supports and the regulation around it to continue to serve us as technology changes as well. And I really enjoy having so many privacy smart community friends around the world now. And I just love having conversations with them because they bring such a different perspective, and particularly they want to see the innovation, they want to see things move forward, but how do we design in from the very beginning? That privacy piece is so key.
100%.
Well, Jen, it's been so great to chat with you, and I really lost track of the time there, but it's been so great to chat with you, and I feel so lucky that you came back onto the podcast, and I'm excited because I think we're going to have some more conversations real soon. And yeah, excited to see what we can do together, because I think there's so much happening now as we come out into a different world in 2022. Building that trust, the collaboration across regions, I think is so important no matter where we are in the world. So thank you again for sharing your wisdom on the podcast.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for everything you do. And we're going to get it done and in person. I'm determined.
Yes, it's going to happen. Can't wait for that. Now, I just have one last question, which is how can people connect with you?
Oh my gosh. So pretty much any social media handle, but LinkedIn, please find me on there, and Twitter and Facebook. And I'm a TikTok watcher, not creator. So I will just don't look for anything but my dog on TikTok from me. But no, please reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, that's where I hang out too mostly. And yeah, we'll put all the links in the show notes so people can click away and find you. So thank you again for coming back onto the podcast. And I really look forward to our next conversation.
Ditto. Thank you so much, Zoe.
Thanks, Jen. Bye.
All right. Bye.
The Smart Community podcast is brought to you by My Smart Community. If you're trying to deal with disruption, not sure what technologies to buy, need to facilitate genuine collaboration, then we can help. Email hello@mysmart.community or head to www.mysmart.community/consulting.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.